Hey everyone, welcome to PunkCast. My name is William Maxwell. I'm a student of Web3 and the owner of Punk 9527. CryptoPunks are 10,000 uniquely generated characters stored permanently on the Ethereum blockchain. No punk is the same. This is a show dedicated to celebrating the punks behind the punk. My hope for this podcast is that we capture the essence of the punk culture, elevate the brand and the individual behind the punk. One last thing. Projects discussed on the show is not financial advice. Crypto and NFTs are a volatile and risky asset class. Please always do your own research. Other than that, let's go. All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of PunkCast. Today, we're with Punk 9275 with three Atties: Shadowbeard, Nerd Glasses, and Police Cap. In real life, he's an artist and engineer that's pioneered generative audiovisual art. Is one of the highest profile artists in the NFT game today. Please welcome DEAFBEEF to the show. DEAFBEEF, how are you, man?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Mate, I'm sort of excited and really humbled that you joined an indie podcast like mine, but great to know that you're a punk and great to have you on.
Yeah. I'm always down to talk about punks. I think that, it was a big part of my entry into the space and just like learning about that culture. And so it has special meaning for me, for sure.
Awesome. Love to sort of unpack that. But why don't we just start with, just a bit of an understanding about your handle? Like, why 0xDEAFBEEF?
Oh, okay, sure. So, I mean, it might be a little bit. I can condense it, right? It's a little bit of a long story, but so I'm an audiovisual generative artist, and I write code. I write low level code in C, in a programming language called C, and I write programs that generate sound and animation. And so I started this project long before I knew anything about NFTs. And so my handle is an example of hexspeak. So hexspeak's probably familiar to people in crypto because they see hexadecimal numbering system in their Ethereum addresses, the 0x prefix, and then words that you can make using only the digits 0 through 9 and A through F. That's the hexadecimal numbering system. So there's hacker culture, programmer culture that have used hexspeak words dating back as long as people have been programming. And one of the existing words was deadbeef. And so deadbeef has been used as a handle for hackers, and it's even the name of a company now or something. And I knew I wanted to have a hexspeak word, but I didn't want to have one that overlapped with that. So I chose a variation of it and said of deadbeef to be deafbeef for associations with sound, and also because it's just kind of something silly and absurd. And I get sort of a kick out of seeing it in print or people having to address me in that way in otherwise serious situations. So, but anyways, it's a reference to a bunch of things, a reference mainly to low-level programming, which was what I used in my art practice.
That's pretty cool. So what was it with dead beef? What did that actually mean?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So deadbeef is the existing one. And what that has a special meaning in programmer culture. And I believe that the linker or the compiler, when you write a program, it will automatically, or the operating system will automatically fill parts of your program memory that you're not supposed to write to with the value deadbeef. So if you're trying to debug your program and you do a hex dump of your program and you look visually at the map of the memory, you're going to see like chunks that say deadbeef, like repeated. And so then you can scan it and see it's like, oh, if you've written to one of those memory locations, it's going to pop out at you. And you're not supposed to, because if you do, you'll crash your program and you'll literally be dead meat. So that's sort of like what it means. So there is this kind of lore behind these things and this kind of nerdy hacker culture that is interesting. And it happened to overlap with crypto just because of the but it wasn't because of that. And now I see that within crypto there's a lot of people that have acronyms or hexspeak words or ZOX something, but it wasn't necessarily because of that.
Love that. So DEAFBEEF, would be great to sort of understand your personal story, everything leading up before sort of crypto. I think you said that you were working on the project before crypto sort of came along, but it'd be good to sort of understand, where you grew up and I guess your general profession before
Sure.
everything all started.
So as a kid, I was really interested in this genre of computer games. This is in the 80s and early 90s. Genre of computer games called roguelikes. And so they're these dungeon crawler computer games where the Well, the ones I were using at the time, they were very simplistic in their visual display. So it'd just be ASCII characters on a grid that represent like what it is that you're seeing. So each character means like a monster or a dungeon tile or an object or whatever. But so they're simplistic in that way. But what was really interesting about it was that the levels were procedurally generated. They were randomly generated every time that you played. And that was absolutely fascinating to me. It was a really formative kind of experience that introduced me to, that was my first kind of exposure to, generative computing and kind of creative computing. And that really inspired me to want to learn to use computers for that type of thing. So yeah, I was programming as a kid basically to sort of imitate these things and explore things for game design with that. I also studied music as a kid and I considered pursuing that, but took kind of a safer route, studied computer engineering in university. But after a year, I dropped out, moved to the city of Toronto and started a recording studio. So I've jumped around a lot, like between various things. It's kind of been like this patchwork of things that kind of balanced between tech and then sort of more arty stuff or like kind of exploratory stuff. And so I've done like I was supporting myself writing web applications, but then running the studio and trying to explore the secrets of sound. And I did that for a few years and then ended up going back to school, studying electrical engineering. I ended up doing some grad work in computer science, specifically in computer graphics. So animation, published some paper at SIGGRAPH. And so after that, then I dropped out again and I was doing various things. I got married, had kids. I developed an interest in blacksmithing and that became first as a hobby. And that became actually my prime source of income. It ended up being that there was a demand for some of the jewelry that I was making using blacksmithing techniques. And so for 3 or 4 years before NFTs, I was making handmade men's wedding rings in materials like stainless steel and titanium, zirconium, and they're all hand forged. They have like a rustic quality, evidence of hammer marks, and it was a good business. That was my full time job. Then the pandemic hit, and we had young kids. My wife and I, we were really like, you know, just overburdened with childcare and trying to keep things together. It was really difficult. Kind of lose all your agency for any type of other anything else. And so my kind of response to that was that okay, well, I still have to find some way to reclaim some of this agency. And so I carved out some time in the evenings after the kids had gone to bed to work on something weird. And for various reasons, the weirdness thing that I chose was to make sounds using only minimal tool set. So using just a laptop and a very conservative programming language without any other type of off the shelf software or any other third party libraries to try to do it sort of from first principles. And so that's how the Deaf Beef project started. I didn't have a name for it then. And really it was just me like rebuilding audio synthesis kind of algorithms and exploring sound in these ways. And after 6 months, um, then I started seeing that on Instagram that there might be an audience for this because there was a modular synth community on Instagram. They like to show, post pictures of like their cables and flashing lights and look like a mad scientist and then have some cool sounds. So I didn't have any of the cables and stuff, so I just posted screenshots of my code and then showed the sounds that were coming out of it. Because on Instagram you have to have some type of visual. You can't just have the sound. And so that picked up some steam and that was like 2020, in the fall of 2020. And then some people that were in my audience, they started recommending. It's like, oh, like maybe your kind of your style or something might be well received with something called NFTs. And I was like, oh, like what's that? And so that's when I started looking into it. And at first, I couldn't understand it. Like it was just, I didn't know what was happening with Ethereum. I had been out of the loop for a really long time. And so I kind of dismissed it first. That was in the fall of 2020. And then people kept telling me things. And then I saw some visual generative artists were finding some success. And then it all came together in February of 2021 when I discovered the Art Blocks platform. And I hadn't ever been on a Discord before. I wasn't on Twitter at all. I didn't know any of that. I'd been living under a rock for like 10 years since my kids were born. At the bottom of the Art Blocks website, because I didn't know where it was. I was like, "What is it? Like, what is it? How do I find out what's going on? Right? Like, you don't know where to start." So at the bottom of the Art Blocks website, there was a little link at the bottom for like the Discord link, and so I clicked on that, and that was like falling down the rabbit hole. Like that was literally the moment. And then I'm like, "Oh, now I'm in like some weird kind of online community with like people with all these weird avatars and like emojis and stuff, and like all these things happening and a lot of excitement, and like people trading like cryptocurrency and like all sorts of stuff. And I was like, whoa, what is going on? Right. So that was a really kind of interesting and like rad time. And that, I mean, I'll pause there and let you jump in, but that kind of connects to like the punk story in a way.
Yeah. Oh man, you mentioned so many different things, and what a journey you've been on. And it just feels like your NFT project was a result of a confluence of different things that and skills that you've sort of acquired over a period of time, right? Like you started talking about nerding out and coding, dabbling with music, and then blacksmithing of all things as well. And there's something artistic about that. But I'm interested a little bit to understand, I guess, your affinity with music. Like, what kind of music were you sort of into, and were you producing music yourself?
Oh, okay, sure. So when I grew up, I studied piano, right? I started playing piano at a pretty young age. Studied classical. I played organ in a church for a couple of years. As a teenager, then I taught myself electric guitar and what played in rock bands. It was the '90s. I was really into like kind of nerdy teenage instrumental guitar. Like I loved like Joe Satriani and Steve Vai, and like many like a lot of guitar focused things, right? And that really doesn't really connect with electronic music very well. But I was kind of like, I mean, it's kind of the experimental nature of it. From Steve Vai, then I got really into. I went through a period of being obsessed with Frank Zappa and his music, and and so kind of the like oddball, off the wall, odd meters, strange recording techniques, exploration of like sound and like non-standard formats. Like that's kind of what that interested me. That kind of nerdy off the wall part of it. So the motivation to move to the city and run a recording studio is because I wanted to like quote unquote like discover the secrets of an alchemy of sound. Like how are records like put together? How do people get those sounds? Like what takes place to make that happen? And a lot of music that I like is focused on sort of the recording and producing part of it. And so that was kind of the background behind that. I don't have a big background in electronic music. I was interested in synths, but at that time, there wasn't as much information available, right? Like it wasn't as easy as, there was not a lot of support from like online communities to be able to build your own stuff like there is now, or like modular synths had like a resurgence recently as in the last 10 or 12 years. But before that, it was something that like you wanted to do it, but you didn't know how. And that kind of like that was the reason that I wanted to go back to school in electrical engineering because I had this romantic notion that I would learn all that stuff to be able to build all those things. Because that's what the engineers in the 1970s did. Like whatever, like all the synthesis people and all the recording engineers were all electrical engineers. But you can see sort of the influence is not really so much like styles of music, really. It's more kind of like the nuts and bolts of it and the weirdness and all those things that kind of go into it.
Yeah. And what about blacksmithing? How did you discover blacksmithing? What made you sort of want to get into that?
Oh, sure. So I think when YouTube started, then I found these cool videos by a kinetic metal artist named Arthur Ganson, and he makes these fragile, whimsical machines, right? Out of metal, and they move and do various things, but like interact with like the one that really struck me was there's this machine with a wishbone, and it makes the wishbone walk, right? Like very slowly. And meanwhile, there's this like kind of whimsical, steampunky kind of machinery behind it that's making it happen. And the video is just like of there's the sound of the machine. Anyways, so I was really, really taken with the kinetic art of Arthur Ganson, and I wanted to do that. It's engineering as well, like like building things. I've always liked doing that, and so eventually I got around to doing some type of night course with welding and things too, because I wanted to make kinetic sculpture, and they had a forge there. So a forge is something that heats up metal, and then when you're blacksmithing, you heat up the metal and it becomes malleable like clay, and you can move it with force like the same way that you would with clay. It just takes a lot more force. And the first time that I saw that, I was just floored. I was like, wow, I want to do that. I want to have that experience. It's a very immersive experience. There's just, simple tools. You're just using heat and then, things like hammers and anvils or whatever tools that you make, to using this homogeneous material to make all these strange organic forms. It's not the same type of forms that you make when you're like assembling things through welding or like machining things or whatever, because it like spreads, and it's like they're organic. You squish things, you bend things, you twist things. And so that just became a really enjoyable experience. It was also kind of a counterpoint to like, most of my life, which was sitting in front of a screen coding. And so having this kind of like alternate kind of low tech endeavor was like, it's a nice counterpoint. It's just like, okay, get me away from a screen. Let's go back to basics and just like have this stuff. It doesn't matter if the power's out. I could still do this. I'm never gonna have to reinstall the operating system for my Anvil. The Anvil is already 200 years old, and nothing's had to change. And there's still interesting things to explore with it. Right. So there's a lot of similarities I find. It might not seem like there is, but there's a lot of connections between blacksmithing and coding in a way. In both cases, you're making your own tools. You're only using one homogeneous material. You don't have to wait around to like, order something from the hardware store, a specialized part in order to proceed. If you need a tool, you make it, right? Like there's nothing else. If you're a woodworker and you need a chisel, you got to go buy it. If you're a blacksmith and you need a chisel, you make the chisel out of steel, and then you use that chisel on other pieces of steel. So it's kind of like this feedback. You can really get into the same type of state when you're working metal as when you're kind of the trance of when you're coding.
That's super cool, man. And I think I saw your drop with proof grails as well. Literally, those NFT grails, they were pretty cool.
That was fun to
Th
do. I really enjoyed doing that.
So are you still doing much blacksmithing today, or are you sort of parking it?
Well, I am, and but not in the same way. Like, I mean, I was in full production making rings before NFTs, right? So I think I made and shipped over 3,000 wedding rings in the span of 3 years, I believe, prior to NFTs, and I can't keep that up anymore. Although I do enjoy that work. I mean, it was really making meaningful adornments for people that it becomes part of their life story. That's pretty meaningful, and also it helped me in some ways actually understand some aspects of NFTs, like about the meaning, the kind of the immaterial meaning of something. Like the ring itself is just a little bit of metal, and it's not even precious metal. It's not gold, right? It's like it's titanium or stainless steel or something. But people ascribe value to it based on kind of the narrative or the story of what it means, how it was made, who made it, the provenance of it, and that kind of prepped me in a way for understanding. It's like, yeah, I could see that you know that people it doesn't matter if you can right click save an NFT, or it doesn't matter that it's not physical. It still has social meaning, right? But so I don't make a ton of rings anymore, but I do make them for my collectors if they want them, and for close friends. I do that as one offs, but I've also worked it into some of my art projects. Like Proof Grails was one of them, but I've done some other. I did a performance with Ferrophile last year where I live streamed myself. I strapped a camera to my head and live streamed myself in my garage. What I did was I ran a generative program, like on the screen. You see me doing it. It makes a design. Oh, I should say actually the seed for the generative program. First, I prick my finger and takes a blood sugar reading from some blood because I'm type 1 diabetic. And then that's the generative seed that seeds this computer program that makes a design. And then after that, in real time, then I look at the design and then I fabricate it in metal. And I do that. I did that like as a performance. It just happened.
What do you mean by creating the seed from
Oh,
a
okay.
drop of your blood?
So, when you have a random number generator, you need to have a seed for it. And so, if we take art blocks as an example, like there's a hash when you mint, like you don't know what you're going to get, right? But it depends on the time that you mint it, and like there's a bunch of pieces of information that go into making this hash, and that becomes the seed. That seed is used by the net random number generator to give a unique sequence of random values. So if you repeat that seed, then you'll get the same thing, right? But if the seed is random, then that's what you want, so that that sequence would be unique. So the input to this system is a numeric value of my blood sugar reading, and so whatever it was on that day, right? Prick my finger using a tool that I made. I sharpened it and prick my finger, and then measure it, and then it's like whatever 6.5, and then that will seed this generative program that will make picture something on the screen. Then it's like, okay, then now I'm going to fabricate it and in real time. Then I use a variety of machines that are electrical and mechanical and all these things, and it's really just kind of a riffing on interconnected systems and authorship and kind of the cybernetic kind of feedback system that we find ourselves we're only one piece of. Anyways, so
No, that's super cool. It's nice lineage and nice provenance to the piece too, and a nice story behind it. I think you mentioned with blacksmithing, you sort of discovered, I guess, how important it is to craft narratives. People are buying not because of the actual piece itself, but more because of the story that's crafted up behind it. What sort of narrative did you craft behind, I guess, your rings that you were sort of creating? And then what sort of narrative do you think is crafted behind your existing sort of NFT work, like synth work that you've made?
sure, sure. So with the rings, like I mean, this really kind of came out of like circumstantially. Like I had no idea. I didn't really plan it. Like I was just making things, and then someone asked me, "It's like, oh, could you make a ring?" I was like, "Yeah, I could try making a ring." And so I made one ring, and then they took pictures of it and shared it, and then a lot of people were asking me to make rings. I was like, wow, there's a lot of interest here, and so I started making spent a lot of time on different kind of recipes to make my own uh designs that made them unique. And I think what people really liked about them was that there was a story that it's handmade first of all, and there's evidence of it being handmade, right? Because you can see the hammer facets, right? Like it's a rustic kind of quality to them. They and That's unique in a world where things are mass manufactured, right? Like especially jewelry and stuff. Like you can get a titanium ring on Amazon for $20 if you want, but you don't want that. Like you don't want that as your wedding ring, right? Like this is supposed to be something that has social meaning that says something about your story as a couple, right? So you don't want it to be that you got it from a gumball machine, right? Unless you're Frank Zappa, that's what he did, just to give the finger to the industrial complex. But yeah, so that's the narrative that was, and also I had a lot of men particularly like them. I didn't set out to have that happen, but I had a lot of messages from. Oftentimes, it would be their fiancés or wives that would interact with me and said, "Oh, like he really hates jewelry. He doesn't want to step into like a jewelry store, but he will wear your ring, right?" So there's this kind of like it's something about saying something about your values, I guess, right? And so it's just a way for people to express their values. It's like, okay, I don't want an expensive, a fancy ring from like a name brand or like a jewelry store, but I will wear a piece of iron that like some Canadian guy like made in his garage, right? They can identify with that. You could see, and so there's this branding that comes from it, but I don't want to make it sound like it's not put on. Like this is just what I was doing, right? And it happened to work.
I was just going to say, I wonder if all these guys that have bought your ring actually realize that it's from DEAFBEEF and the brand that you've built behind the NFT space today, and whether or not they would ascribe more value to it now
Oh,
than they did before.
I don't know. I think it's kinda 2 different worlds, right? Like, I mean, we really find ourselves like I don't know if it would have any more value or not, maybe. I think that the many of the people that bought my rings wouldn't necessarily have maybe any interest in the rest of the things that I do, and also vice versa, but maybe there's some overlap. I mean, it's an interesting thing to me, like, before I started doing like, releasing my things as NFTs, like my audiovisual work, like, I was still doing it. I was posting on Instagram, and I'd started making this kind of brand for myself because I had the idea that I was, "Okay, maybe I'll release a record." Right? Or something. This is before I did anything with NFTs, and so I had a Bandcamp page, and it's all the same material, like in a way, right? Same style, some of the same algorithms that show these visuals, and it's kind of funny that there's like these really kind of separate universes because at the same time that things were starting to take off, like in 2021. And then, my stuff was sitting there, and then I got like a little cha-ching thing in my email, and someone had purchased my album for I think like $5. Right? And so it's like it's like really different. Like it's so funny that these things are so separate, and depending on what world you're in, like it's really hard to imagine that, there's things on the other side. And like when if you were here in the summer of 2021, it felt like we're the center of the universe. But like really it really is kind of a microcosm, and you can't really see that unless you're step back a bit.
Yeah, no, it's super cool. I'm sure they're going to be collector's items once people figure it all out over time. And what about? And it sounded like from your rings, it's not like you were out there to craft a particular narrative. It just felt like it was naturally sort of coming through. But what about your NFTs then? What was your first drop? Was it the Synth Poems? Was your first drop?
Synth Poems was the first one that I did. Yes, that was in March 2021.
March 2021. So, I mean, what was your? I mean, that was sort of before my time getting into the sort of the NFT art space. But what sort of ambition did you have for synth poems at the time?
So at the time, it was all new to me, right? And so my ambitions were like pretty conservative. Like I just saw that there was this enormous interest in, visual generative art, like and that was was in the Art Blocks Discord and seeing that happen. And what I had been working on prior to that was like very sound based, and so I didn't see a whole lot of examples of sound based generative art in the NFT space yet. Although the other Discord that I was in was Euler Beats at the time, and so that was the other one. It was like the same day that I discovered Art Blocks. I think that Euler Beats launched, and I saw like how much interest there was in this, and I was like, okay, I got to do something, right? Because I want to put my flag out there, right? It's like, okay, I do generative music. I want to show like what's possible, and so I spent Art Blocks already had like a huge kind of lineup, like a queue. There was no way that like it would be months and months and months before that anything would take place, and so figured that I'd have to do it on my own. And so I spent a couple of weeks just like speed learning Solidity and everything. And it was a blur. Somehow I got it all together, put together like an existing, refined like an existing sound algorithm that I had for synth poems, and then ended up. I knew that there had to be like a visual element to it. I wanted to be sound based, but there needed to be a visual element. So I ended up using a visualization, this oscilloscope visualization, as a reference to early electronic art. And I did that intentionally because at the time, like it seemed like this was a very new audience. Like they didn't. It seemed like a lot of people didn't really. They felt like generative art was extremely novel, and it was a novel in that form, but there wasn't as much discussion about like sort of the history of these things that I was aware of just because of my time studying computer graphics. Like I knew a little bit about um, things that had come before, and so I wanted to make a reference to that, um, specifically Ben Lipovsky in his Oscillon series, and also Herbert Franke, who uh, who made photographic generative work with oscilloscopes as well.
Yeah, nice. And what was the art box sort of vibe back then? Were you sort of engaging with SnowFro and the like, trying to find a way to get onto the Artbox platform? And what was it? The whole
So yeah, so I'll tell you a story. So like I said, like I just like went down the rabbit hole and arrived in Discord for the first time, and like just like seeing all trying to figure out like I was just glued to my phone like reading Discord like as this feed like progressed, right? And it's like, okay, who are all these people? And like a lot of them are anonymous, and like just trying to figure out like what is going on. Um and then there's this guy, and he seems like he's like he's like the kingpin of the operation, and he's like really smart, really engaging, and really like enthusiastic and encouraging. And he has this avatar, and it's a pixelated zombie, and I'm like, what is this? Right? I didn't know who he was or like what was going on. And I think that Snowfro was the first person that I DM'd, right? And like I was learning about what was happening with like the on-chain narrative and like storing things and trying to get things together for my own thing about storing my code on chain. And I DM'd him because I felt like I discovered something. I was like, oh, there might be a better way to store things on chain. You might be able to save like some gas costs or something if you did it this way. And also, it was like, kind of there was also kind of a selfish motive, like, I wanna get in touch with them, right? Like, I just like, I wanna be connected with what's happening here, right? And, like, surprisingly, like, he responded, like, right away with, like, all sorts of, like, enthusiasm and just, like, a lot of information and so helpful. And, um, like, my entry into the space could have been way different. I mean, because there's so many bad actors, right? And just, like, that I hit the jackpot, like, interacting with, like, art, not just art blocks, but with like Snowfro specifically. And also Jake Rockland, who's another he's now his handle is Purple Hat, right? And he's engineer at Art Blocks now. he was a mod, I believe, and he was another person that I interacted with at the time. And to get advice on, like, I had my drop ready to go, and I was just wanted to like test it, like what do you think, And he had a lot of great feedback, and there was so much good energy in the Art Blocks Discord. It could have been way different. There was so many things just fell together for me, and I feel really fortunate to have discovered that community.
Amazing. So what did you make of these pixelated zombies at that time? Like what was going through your mind?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's hard to remember, like, sequentially, like, what happened, right? Because I'd get, like, tidbits of information and then be like, "Okay, I don't know what that is, but, like, I'll note it and then come back to it later," because it was all new to me. Everything was completely new. Like, I think that I'd seen, like, I'm sure that, like, I saw, like, autoglyphs and I was just like, "Oh, that's cool." Like, what but whatever. And, like, I didn't know, like, what it was. And, like, I heard about Beeple and I just didn't know what it was. And so I don't know when it dawned on me, but, like, that was my first memory though, was the pixelated zombie. And then I think probably it was probably from discussions, like, there was people that were talking about, like, getting their first punk. I think that Jake Rockland, like, he swapped in the NFTX pool, like, there you could do that. So, you could swap a few times and you would get a random punk, like, from what was in the pool. And so I remember that, and then he had his purple hat one with the frown. Um, and so I think it wasn't until I don't think after my first drop, Synth Poems, that, like, I didn't know about the Punks Discord. Like, I didn't know about that. I just had art blocks and Euler beats, like, in my sidebar. That was it, just those two. Um, but little by little, it was like exploring, like, a new kind of, like video game, like multiplayer world or something, and, like, discovering all these different, characters and lore, and, like, understanding about, like, the history of things. And, you get tidbits here and join different discords and find things out. And so that was a really exciting time for me. Yeah. And then somehow, like, yeah, I came to understanding of punks. And then there is, like, I can tell a story at, like, you know at one point, like, decided it's like, okay, I gotta have one.
Yeah,
Right?
talk us through that story. So it sounded like you got into the Art Blocks Discord first. You saw some people in the Discord with some funny, strange looking pixelated things, SnowFro and Purple Hat, who were quite prominent in the space as well. And was that sort of the genesis of what drove you to, dig a little bit deeper into punks?
Think what it was, like, at the when I discovered all these things happening, like, I still was pretty skeptical. Like, it was so much at once, right? I was like, "Okay, this stuff is cool, but, like, the prices are insane." Right? Like, it just didn't make sense. That part, like, didn't quite make sense to me. And to be honest, like, I didn't buy any NFTs at first. Like, I sold the synth poems, and the first thing I did, like, my original goal was like, "Okay, if I could say that I made a few $1,000s, like, selling my art, like, I'd be happy." Right? And so I did that, and then I pulled it all out. I pulled it out to my bank account. I was like, "Okay, all right, there, I won." And I thought about it for about, I think it was, like, maybe, like, less than 24 hours, right? And then 24 hours later, like, the next day, I was like, "You know what? No. Like, th there's something here," right? And so I just, like, I bought back in, like, completely, right? I was like, "This was free. This is, like, free roll and stuff," so I bought back in. So with the proceeds from my drop, I was like, "No, this I'm gonna make it feels right." And I decided that I was gonna buy a punk and a quarter of an autoglyph, because you could do that with NFTX. You could buy, like, a fractional piece of something, right? Of an ERC20 that was, like, redeemable if you had a whole one for an autoglyph. So I bought a quarter of an autoglyph and a punk. And to me, that felt like that was, like, the right thing to do.
Amazing. So you basically you rolled over the proceeds from your first project, Synthwaves, into a punk and a quarter of an
Yes.
autoglyph. So this was in. I'm just looking at the records for Punk 9275. That was 11th of April 2021. So that was still, just before the bull market kicked off for punks. So you got in at 23.7 ETH, which is a pretty good entry. Why don't you talk us through a little bit about your, I guess, your selection process for a punk? I mean, 9275 is police cap, shadow beard, nerd glasses. I can see a little bit of resemblance, but how are you looking at traits and which ones to sort of pick out then?
Yeah. So, I mean, if I hadn't if it hadn't have been for, like, synth poems, like, I would never have, like, risked, like, I was too risk averse. Like, I never would have taken, like, my own money like to go and buy a CryptoPunk. Like I all props to people who did that because that's incredible, right? I was treating it as free roll. Otherwise, I just wouldn't have been able to justify it to myself or my family to like really do that at that price, right? But I figured, okay, like this is the right thing to do with this investment that like I've made like a gargantuan sum to me from from selling my art. Like I should reinvest it somehow in the space. And so I knew I wanted punk. And so I went around and at first I like tried to bid on things. I liked the clown hair. I wanted to have something that was sort of mad scientist-y. But, I saw that like, okay, well, I might be waiting forever, right? Like I could put a bid, but like if it's not listed, like who knows, right? I was new to sort of these dynamics of the collectible market. And so then I found the punks Discord and I saw like, there's people that are trading and sniping them. Like one will come on and they'll put a bid or they'll snipe it and stuff. So once I had the idea that I wanted one, then I had a budget. I was like, okay, I'll pay up to 25 ETH or something. I'm just gonna wait for something to come through because at the time, like there would sometimes people would list them and they wouldn't know that the trait was a little bit more valuable. Like the market was still not as efficient yet, right? Because there was people waking up, wallets waking up and being like, "Holy moly, I can sell my punks now!" Like whatever, just floor it, right? So I waited around to see like if there was something that was going to come up, and it was on a Sunday morning and someone listed it, and I was like, "Oh, like these are kind of neat traits, like, nerd glasses." Like, I mean, I'm not a cop, right? But like the police cap is that's sort of like, that's a punk reference actually to like the UK. Like, that's what sometimes they'd wear those, right? It was like a fashion item um, and Shadow Beard, and I'm like, okay, I could make that work, right? And whether or not it was going to become like my avatar, I didn't really have a plan for that. It was just like I want a punk, and it's like, okay, well, this is an interesting one, and it came up, and then. People were sort of commenting on it, and you judge it by like the emojis that people were putting, like how many fire emojis like were on the listing. And so then, I went out to the garage and I thought about, it, I was like, okay, all right. And then I rushed back in and then like, you come over and you have this feeling of just like, oh my God, I'm gonna spend like 23 ETH on this. This might be the worst or the best idea of my life. And then dropped it, right? And then it's fun, like the whole idea of like part of this experience is literally like, the punks Discord and seeing the listing bot, like the sales bot, like announce the sale and then people put emojis, right? And then like and then people welcome you to the club and stuff. So that was like a really fun thing. I took a screenshot of it, like just to save for myself. That was a fun experience.
Yeah, that's super cool, man. Like to be honest, like that was, I probably wasn't lurking on the art blocks Discord that early, nor and probably just more observing in the punks Discord. I didn't really sort of catch on until a little bit later on, but like the more I sort of started this punk cast of sort of discovering people with punks that I didn't know that had punks. And I think I came across you because I was also looking at the cowboy punk that went on sale recently for, I mean, the price dropped pretty quick. And I saw you snipe that. So that's probably the only reason how I sort of found out that you are into punks. And so you've got another three punks, two cowboys, and also you've finally got the green hair punks as well. Like, how do you how are you sort of thinking about your collection and accumulating this? I think it's kind of exciting, right?
Yeah. I mean, like, so how am I thinking about my collection? Well, like after I got like that one punk, right? Like the cop punk, like I figured that would be it, right? But like as things went like in 2021, like I made other revenue from like my other drops and stuff and I wanted to put it to somewhere in the space like on top of, buying other art and things. It just felt right. Like it felt like, okay, this is still going somewhere. And so I did buy and sell a few punks at that time. And the cowboy punk, I had one cowboy punk that I got like just on the day that things like exploded for real, right? I had in mind is like, you know what? Like I'm gonna make a long-term investment. I want to have like some nice trait punks, and I couldn't afford like anything like a zombie or whatever. And it seemed like something like cowboy hat would be that seems like a good trait, a good solid trait. And so that was the first cowboy buy that I did in 2021. And oh, you know what? Okay, well, let's talk about the clown-haired punk with nerd glasses. That was the punk that I originally wanted, like, something with, like, like clown hair and glasses, kind of mad scientist type of vibe. And when things, I don't know, I forget which like mini crash it was, but like sometime in the spring of 2021, when things just like really descended, like bonkers and stuff, and someone listed it, and I was like, oh, like this is my chance. And I happened to be, have some stuff on the sidelines. I was really happy to scoop that one up, and that was right at the bottom. It was lovely that it worked out that way. So I'm really I really like that one as part of my collection. That's like one of the ones that would be that I would sell last. So, yeah, I've bought and sold punks, and some of them, it's been for different reasons. And I had 8 at one point, but I couldn't justify owning that many punks. I was in a good position to when that other cowboy came up, like, I thought it would be neat to have pocket cowboys, right? Because that's just, it just makes sense, right? Like, you could be, you're playing poker in a saloon, right? And you get deal pocket kings. That's cowboys. So
No, it's super cool. You got a really awesome collection. But I mean, I think it was OMZ I had on the podcast a while back, and he pointed out that what makes punks really special and probably with gives it a lot of credibility is that a lot of artists also collect punks, and that probably says a lot about the collection itself. For you as an artist, what does punks mean to you, or what do you see in punks?
yeah. So I mean, punks to me, what made me like when I discovered about like who it was that made them, right? About like Matt and John and like their history. They weren't the first NFTs, but they were like they set some milestones in terms of like, like a successful online community of like tradable digital assets and having the built-in marketplace. And everything kind of came together for it. And having this kind of not too serious, like, aesthetic, like, I'm not gonna say like, I mean, it is nerdy, I guess, but, like, it's fun, like, the absurdity of, like, some of the trade combinations, like, uh, it's exploratory, like, it's like an experiment, and people know that, like, all the early adopters and things, like, these are people, like, kind of, that are they're testing things, like, on the fringe, right? And so you get a lot of interesting, like, personalities, and so like, those people I've come to know, like that I think that's like super fascinating. There's a lot of story behind it. And if, you know, we don't know for certainty that like NFTs or Ethereum are going to be a thing. We don't know with certainty. I feel pretty confident that they will. But if they are, there's no way that like punks are going to be part of that. Do you know what I mean? And so like they have to be, right? It's a cornerstone of it. And so if you want to talk about like investment theses, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's cool, and, I think it gives me a lot more conviction and comfort knowing, you know, artists sort of see the same things as what we do, and so we're not, sort of blowing smoke up our own.
Yeah, and I mean, what one thing I will say too is like, I mean, there's been discussion, like I see discussion with like, I won't name like things, but like in the art world about like, okay, well, are punks art or not, right? And like, are they just collectibles? And like, what does that mean? And like, in terms of like artists, like, do artists collect punks? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't. I was not a professional artist before. I'm not an art like historian or anything, but I don't think that they're only collectibles. I think that there's something unique about them and about the like the combination of traits and things and like things with portraiture and also just like the format, the form of them, about like the original 10,000, like why 10,000? Why does that work? Right? And like we've seen it replicated so many times. There's something about that that I think is super interesting. And whether or not it's art, I don't know. I would say that it is. I think that they're on par with as art objects, not just as collectibles.
Yeah, I'm with you. It it's interesting as well. I think when you look at art from an NFT perspective, like I think, well, in the traditional art world, it feels like it's more from the aesthetic sort of point of view. But I think when you dig in deeper to punks, there's something conceptual about it as well. I mean, think about the smart contracts and the influence that it's had. You mentioned the 10K piece, which has influenced a lot of collections that we sort of see today as well, right? So I think there's so many different angles of it too. So which makes it a beautiful collection.
And also, like you said, like I mean, it was an influence for many artists and builders in the space. Like, I mean, look how much SnowFro was influenced by punks, right? There wouldn't be art blocks if it wasn't for punks. And so yeah, it's influential. Like there's no question about it.
Awesome. So, DEAFBEEF, I heard in the rumor mill that you might have had something to do with putting punks on chain. Is that true or false?
Yeah, that's true. I can tell you a bit about the story with that. So the way that the Punk's contract is set up is there's the PNG of the Punk images, right? There's that one PNG. It has all 10,000 punks in that image, but the image doesn't actually. It's not stored itself on chain. All that's stored is a hash of that image. So you, as long as you have that image, you could take the hash and verify that it's correct, but you couldn't retrieve it if it was lost. And so there's been this kind of since 2017. There's been this kind of value that in the space for things that are on chain, right? That you don't have to. This comes from crypto values of not having to trust and like decentralization and having things on chain, so that if the web service goes out of business or like the artists disappear, you can't get rugged, basically, right? That it's all there. And so that's the same thing. Like autoglyphs were like the response to that. Like autoglyphs are example of generative art that's on chain. It exists like immediately in the contract, and like art blocks as well, storing the program on chain. And so in 2021, with all the attention that came to on-chainness and punks and all like things that were involved, there was an effort led by SnowFro to come up with ideas to store the punk's image on chain, right? And he'd had ideas about this before, like even in like 2020 or earlier, I believe that he'd put something together and bounced ideas off of LarvaLabs about a way to do that, like maybe get the community to pitch in, right? To contribute some money or like some type of like mechanism for verifying like your image or somehow communally do this. And so he had some ideas, and I was on the Punk Discord, and these ideas I heard were floating around that they were going to do this, and I was like, oh, I might be able to help with this, right? Because Snowfro's method, it made sense, but there was I thought there was an optimization that you could do to make it a lot cheaper to store all that information if you could compress it somehow, losslessly, right? And so because otherwise it would be like an enormous cost, like 100 ETH or something, I think is what they were talking about. And that's okay if you split it up, but I was like, oh, I think we could do this more efficiently. And so I came up with a way to because a lot of the punks are similar, right? They're not, and so if you have a lot of similarity in image, then it makes sense that you should be able to. That's redundant information that you can compress it somehow. And so and beyond using like a compression scheme like PNG or something, we know more structure about the image, right? We know that there's only so many traits. We know that the like you should be able to somehow squish it. And so I came up with the idea of, okay, well, let's store 50 of the punks, and then we will um, for the rest of them, we will compare them to those 50 and only store the difference. And so that you have like a starting punk and then like a way to change only the pixels that you would need to reconstruct the individual punk. And so it ended up being like a cost savings of like 10 times or something. That would only
That's
cost like
awesome.
10 ETH or something to put on chain. And so Snowfro, um, so I worked with SnowFro and LarvaLabs together, and I told Snowfro about this. He was really excited. He was like, "Okay, let's bounce this off LarvaLabs," and so he was able to do that. They came back and said, "Oh, well, this is a really interesting method. We think that we could even do it better because we have the generator code." And so they were able to make an even more efficient encoding by having just storing each trait once, and then storing a string of the traits themselves, so that you can reconstruct them from those traits. And so that's what ended up getting deployed in August 2021.
That's amazing. So you're part of, I guess, the punk history now as well, as being part of that journey, getting everything on chain.
I'm super proud. Like I was just doing this like with like to see if we could do it, and Snowflake mentioned that maybe we could work with Larva Labs. I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. That's amazing, right? If we could be part of that. And so yeah, I'm really proud of that collab.
That's
That's a big
this
part
is
of like my memory of this whole journey for sure.
this is amazing. I love unpacking this because I don't know if many people know about these little sort of side stories about punks, and I think each one of these podcasts is sort of building them sort of step by step. But what was the general gist and motivator for Snowfro leading to get punks on chain? Like, do you remember that type of dialogue and conversation? What was a sort of genesis of that?
He'd been thinking about that for years, like, before I even before I knew about NFTs at all, right? So he'd had, and before punks were worth a whole lot. Like, this was, I think he said in 2020 or earlier, like, maybe even 2019, he wanted to he had the idea to put it on chain, and like this, like I said, like, this was sort of like a value that had been, like, having things on chain is a value that's got that it's been a value within crypto culture for years. And so I think that there was a lot of thought about, like, how to do that. Like, so there's been projects like Avastars, like Autoglyphs, and like other things like prior to art blocks with like sorry, like chain faces, right? Like Nate Alex has a lot of things in the on-chain stuff as well, about storing things entirely in the smart contract so that there's no external dependency. And I mean, it makes sense that SnowFro was thinking about that, because that's like a big part of art blocks as well, storing the generative code that produces the images. That code is stored on chain. And so that was part of it. And also there was like sort of like a communal part of it. It's like, okay, can punks like band together and like do this? You know what I mean? To like have s- like store have a permanent record of these digital collectibles.
Nice. And what was your interaction with Matt and John like?
It was cool. Matt and John are actually from Toronto, right? They studied at the University of Toronto, same as me. I mean, they're a bit older than me, but so I got along well with them. Matt is like really, sorry, John is like really, technically gifted, and like I was honored basically to be part of this group, right? So I'm in a Discord like channel with Matt and John and Snowfro, right? So it's like, oh wow, like they like in like July of 2021, right? Like that was like that just felt like, it was like it was the center of the universe somehow. So yeah, it was pretty fun.
It's awesome.
They're cool
And
guys.
and it's a general principle that you carry across into your work too around
Yeah.
on chain work.
So, like, I mean, it was circumstantial that the way I had been working, like using, like, I had this idea before NFTs, like, I'm going to use minimal code, minimal tool set to like build from scratch, like audio synthesis. And that was just like kind of a weird constraint that I imposed on myself, like as a challenge. And also to not have to depend on like any outside technology changing on me, right? Like having to come back to things and then discovering that, they don't work anymore like a year later, and have to like reinstall an operating system or third party software. So I had this ethos of that, and it was circumstantial that kind of intersected with the values of decentralization and on-chainness, like in crypto. And I didn't, I, di- so I just like, it was random and lucky, fortunate that value existed. I was like, oh, well, I have self-contained C code, and I could store that on chain. It doesn't depend on anything else. And, you need a C compiler anyways to compile Ethereum. So it's not even an extra dependency. And so, yeah, I can't take credit for that. It was basically like, it was wild that all those things intersected.
It's beautiful. And it's a nice story and narrative that you created behind your work as well. And when you look across, I guess the collections that you've made, Synth Poems, Angular Transmission, Entropy, etc. Like, what sort of speaks to you the most? Like, or do you have a favorite? Would that be too much to ask?
No, no, that's fine. Yeah, I guess it depends on like what dimension. I would probably say that Entropy is probably my strongest work. Like conceptually, aesthetically, just kind of like as how everything sort of came together. With that. Um, yeah,
That's the one with the degrading function built
yes,
into it, right?
yes. So
So,
Entropy it's an audiovisual generative work, um, and the code that produces it is stored on chain. But paradoxically, that code is um, programmed to and the smart contracts programmed such that the uh, the the audiovisual content will degrade after every transfer, so it becomes blurrier. The sound becomes more muffled, like progressively, and so after number of transfers, then it will sort of like kind of wash away eventually after many transfers.
is there a limit to a bottom line, or does it keep degrading? like
It will
infinite.
keep degrading infinitely, but, like, I kind of engineered it so that I didn't know in advance, like, how often they were gonna be traded, right? I think that probably by, like, 20 or 30 transferred, it would be, like, unrecognizable. It would probably be mostly a wash of noise,
That's
right?
crazy.
Yeah.
That's sort of nice, and it's, sort of almost like, collecting, you know, basketball cards where they get things graded, and, the more times you sort of transfer them around, the corners are rigid, they're off-centered, they start degrading over a period of time if you're not taking care of it. So
Yeah.
it's kinda nice if we could sort of do that in the digital space.
Yeah, it's kind of like I mean, it's sort of, like, it's a comment on maybe, like, on some of the values of crypto, like permanence and ownership, and also kind of questions those things, right? Because paradoxically, like, I mean, it's an artificial degradation, right? Like the code itself that makes that degradation happen is stored on chain. So, if you wanted to, you could always like cheat and like download the code and like reconstruct your token. Right? Like it's not like it's irretrievably lost. It's just that it says, okay, if you're honoring like what it says on the blockchain, then it has to be in this state, right? You know what I mean? And so it's degraded 5 times because it says that it did. But that's the only reason, right? And it's funny that people will value them differently, right? It's like, okay, well, this is one that is this freshly mint, it's in mint, quote unquote condition. And then here's one that's degraded twice. Is it worth more or less? And why? Right? And it's just because of social consensus. And like how are we deciding that any of this stuff has value? And meanwhile, it's sort of like an artificial social consensus because it's not like it really has permanently degraded. Um, so I think that there's a dogma in it's almost a dogma of crypto culture, uh, like this value of permanence. And I think that um like there's a lot of rhetoric about like Ethereum being eternal or on-chain things being eternal, and I think we have to recognize that even if things are stored there, quote unquote, permanently, like it's their interpretation that's important. It's not the fact that the data is stored there, because the interpretation could change, right? It's just a bunch of data there, and if we decide one day that it's like, okay, well, I mean, nothing is stopping you physically from reconstructing that token in mint condition. It's just that you're agreeing to obey the rules that are there. Um, and so, yeah. Anyways, it's kind of a mishmash of themes related to that.
No, it's super fascinating. Maybe just along that line of permanence, and, admittedly, I'm probably a bit of an ETH maxi. I mean, as an artist, would you consider, you know, minting any of your work on any other chains outside of Ethereum?
Um, let's see. Would I consider it? I think that when I did the Ferrophile exhibition, so that was originally on the Bitmark chain, but I think that Bitmark, I think that since then they've transferred it all to Ethereum. So yeah, I generally stick to Ethereum. Although I'm not like a complete like maxi. I think the art is more important than the chain itself. Like from an art point of view, like I mean from, like from an investment or like monetary value point of view, then I think that then of course there's arguments that it will matter. So I think it really depends what lens you're looking at it through. Um,
Mm.
because I mean, like people, there's this idea is okay, well, it's permanent if it's on Ethereum and on chain. But like, there's so many ways that like the artist could like rug you, like the artist could remint their work like a million times. Like, what's going to stop them from doing that? They could go and mint it on other chains and stuff, right? So there's going to always be an element of trust with the artist, right? And I think if a chain like went bust, if and really unlikely, but if Ethereum went bust, then I'm sure that there would be some like transfer, like the method that everybody would agree on. That would we would take your things that were culturally valuable or artistically important, and like sanctioned by the artist or their estate, and they would move it to whatever, like Ethereum version 2 or whatever it is that's coming next, and people would be okay with that, right? Because um, yeah, like let's not kid ourselves. Like how long has Ethereum been around? Um, Not very long in the grand scheme of things, right? And
Yeah.
things will change in some way, and even if Ethereum does stick around, the interpretations will change. The programming languages that or the media file formats that we're putting on that we're storing things in, all those things are going to change. on any, like, you just have to go on a longer time scale, and they will. So, yeah.
No, it's an interesting one because yeah, I mean, I won't go into too much now, but I think I've got a mental sort of block when it comes to buying art or anything of value outside of the ETH chain, and I think when you see things like Luna and maybe like Solana, blockchain sort of going down, the question of permanence always goes into a bit of risk, and I think that's what you're paying a little bit more for Ethereum on, even though it is a little bit more expensive. And I guess the other side of it as well is like, at the high end of the marketplace, I sort of feel like the blockchain is almost like, locations in terms of where things are being purchased, right? So like in the real world, Christie's and Sotheby's have a reason why they are only auctioning pieces of artwork in New York, London, Paris, Hong Kong. I don't think anybody likes to say that they bought a Warhol from, I don't know, some small town village in the middle of nowhere. And I think similarly, I think that might be the same for some of the blockchains too. And in some ways, I sort of feel like artists that come onto the space that are minting outside of Ethereum, and this is no disrespect to them and their work, and not true in all cases, but feels like they probably haven't done a lot of the work, and that they were probably encouraged by incentives to mint on alternative sort of blockchains, sort of coming in. So I think it's got a little bit of that less genuine, authentic vibe and feel to it. But I think when it's sort of coming through Ethereum and join the art community, it sort of feels a bit more genuine and authentic. I don't know. That's sort of my sort of take on that.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's certainly from like an investment, like just purely as crypto artifacts, right? Like, I mean, and so there's two different, like I said, there's like two kind of different lenses, right? And like as like investment monetary value, things have value as sort of as crypto artifacts, right? Like an autoglyph is worth what it is, not only because of like its artistic value, but because it's an on-chain artifact on Ethereum from 2019. And that's what people are betting on, right? Like it's investment grade because of that, right? But that's completely separate from its artistic value, right? Because um, you can have brilliant piece of work, and if someone decided to mint it on Solana, why why it doesn't change its artistic value unless the work is about blockchains, unless that's its theme. But otherwise, it doesn't change its artistic value, but it certainly changes its investment value, right? Just like you said, right? So yeah, you won't have the same market for it for like all these different reasons. But I like to sort of keep those two things in mind, that they're not necessarily related,
Makes
the
sense.
artistic and the monetary value.
Makes sense. If money wasn't an issue for you, what would be your dream punk? Do you think?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. Yeah, like purely in terms of like aesthetics, right? Like basically,
Yeah.
I mean, like yeah. So not necessarily like an alien, right? I think that what would if it wasn't an issue, I think that what's interesting is having some type of combination of punks. Like it's not really about like any one in particular, although there's lots that are interesting in their own right. But like having a cohesive collection, or have some type of interesting relationships between them, I find that to be quite interesting. And like people talk about even like their location in the grids, right? Like the PNG
Ah,
grid. And so
interesting.
there's corner punks, there's like edge punks, right? And you have to get really nerdy to like consider these things, but like I kind of find that fascinating. Provenance, like, oh, there's so many dimensions that you could do it across.
Yeah. I never heard of that before. I never heard of anybody collecting punks based on the location in the grid.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, for sure. Yeah, corner punks. Yeah.
ch- I need to do some research on that. Corner punks, there might be extra value there. Well, yeah, you're right. There's so many dimensions. Like I think we've spoken a few times on the podcast about dev punks. The being the first 1,000. Specific numbers. That people sort of go for or have an affinity for as well. So, which is kind of cool. And then, when you're looking across, I guess the CryptoPunk community in general, do you have a favorite punk or punks that sort of come to mind?
The early adopters, like that really impresses me. Like people that like, really stuck through it, and like and even like collected and then like round trip them or whatever, like just to hold on to them. And so Not anyone in particular, but like I mean, like SnowFro is among them. Stray Bits, uh, uh, Dave with two V's. I don't know if you know Dave, but and so like yeah, I've rasterized like just a huge respect for all those people, and yeah, like all the interesting personalities I vibe with.
Yeah. They're all really cool names that you just mentioned as well. And if you were to describe punk culture in a few words, how would you describe that for you?
That's hard. In a few words, I mean, experimental has to be part of it. Like just like this kind of notion of like exploring and experimenting technically, but it's also it's nerdy, it's eccentric, but something of that kind of flavor of it, right? Like it's like a little bit absurd in a way, right? That you have like people just like in their bedrooms, like congregating on an online community and like paying hundreds of dollars for like a like a digital record, right? Of a pixelated image. That's awesome.
I think you've hit it spot on, and I asked that question on basically every single podcast, and you know uh, when you sort of say experimenting, at sort of the forefront, most punks that are on here specifically for that reason. They're all building something new. They got into punks because they were curious and they were sort of experimenting as well, and similar
Cur
to you and
Curious is the right word. That's the
yeah.
word. Curious is the right word.
Yeah, and it seems like it was your sort of journey as well, right? I think with your sort of first project, so you definitely sort of fit into the punk values bucket. And I'll ask you a couple other questions now that have been part of the punk history and culture, but it'd be good to understand your sort of take on it. Do you have a view on punks?
I mean, not no, I don't have a really strong opinion about that. And I mean, again, like I wasn't around at the time of the claim and stuff, right? So I'm kind of like well, not even second wave, but like but much further wave. So I don't have a particular view. I kind of um too much I kind of stay out of too much of the conflict around that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's fair. And were you around when Yuga took over
Yes.
CryptoPunks
Yes.
IP? And how did you take that news?
It was very surprising. In fact, uh, there's a platform where you can bet on outcomes of things, right? Like in like on-chain ways, right? So you could bet on the outcome of like an election or whatever. And there was I forget what it was, but there was a bet about I don't know if it was specifically about that, but something related. And I thought it was free money, like that people were like making this counter bet. So I bet against it and I ended up losing when because Yuga bought CryptoPunks. So yeah, it was quite surprising. And like I don't know the ins and outs of it, right? And I can sympathize a little bit with maybe the way that like Matt and John like were feeling during the period of intense hype, right? Like I'm thankful for everything that happened with what happened with my stuff, but I was also, part of I felt pretty anxious during those times, just like under the like, I don't know. It just felt wild, right? Like the having these big wheels turn, like that amount of money being thrown around and various expectations being put on you. And it would have been like times 1,000 for them. And so, yeah, like, I mean, I did feel like a little bit like it definitely changed things in a way, right? It definitely changed things, but I can understand somewhat about why that might have happened.
What do you mean by change? Like, what changed you?
It changes the story. I mean, it all becomes part of this ongoing lore, right? And, like, up until then, like, CryptoPunks were they just were, right? Like, this is a time when, like, people were trying to figure out how to value things, like, based on, like, whether it's utility or whether, like, what speculate on, like, what the artists are gonna do next or what this is gonna do next or whatever, and meanwhile, punks didn't have to do any of that, right? There was just like, "Okay, CryptoPunks exist, right? And it's like almost the best thing you could do is just do nothing, right? And there's like the idea of like Mitchell Chen wrote an article about it. Actually, he's another artist, and he compared it to the comic artist Bill Watterson, who made the Calvin and Hobbes, and I don't know if you know about him, but he didn't license his stuff to anything, right? Like he was offered so much money for all these things, and at the end of it, he just said, "Okay, this is the last Calvin and Hobbes comic," and then he was like, "See ya," and he moved to the woods, right? And it's just perfect. Like you don't see Calvin and Hobbes like on any t-shirts or cereal boxes or like, you know what I mean? It didn't get consumed by like the industrial like, yeah, you know, just like, and so we're thinking like punks kind of felt that way, but then it changed that, right? And you know, you think like if it's a you know, you think of these things are like markers of your values, right? And so then it's like, okay, well, what happens when something you use as your online identity gets consumed by this other thing that maybe you don't really vibe with as much, and then like what do you do, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So I sort of felt like that as well, and that I think, mentally, punks were just a pure thing, just meant to be. People can just use it, hang out, and just vibe. And I think when you bring in, a company that has a primary objective of trying to, monetize that, it feels a bit extractive and probably going against the I guess the whole punk sort of theme, right? And makes us feel a little bit less punk. So I could sort of resonate with what you're sort of saying there as well. And I think there was a meme going around, people afraid of getting punk lunch boxes, right? So
yes.
yeah,
What I would like to say though is um, credit to like Noah Davis is the well, I forget what his title is, but he's like the brand
brand
manager, I guess,
ambassador.
for brand ambassador for CryptoPunks. And he's taken like a lot of feedback from the community, and um he, you know, he understands that like the best thing to do with CryptoPunks is sort of as little as possible. And so it like, I mean, credit there, right? Like it's not like immediately trying to blast it out, you know, and like in the ways that you described, right? So I mean, but then the thing is, like, I mean, when you're tied to like this conglomerate company, like who knows who the next person it is that's going to manage it, and like, you know, like you don't, you lose that kind of control, kind of thing. So for now, I think I think it's good. I hope it takes that direction, but you lose some control, and it might end up going badly in the future. I hope
Yeah,
that it doesn't. And yeah, that's all.
yeah. No, absolutely. I think Noah's done a great job as well, and getting us into some of the museums in the right hands. And
Yes,
um,
absolutely. Yeah. So I hope that continues like beyond like, you know, in the future, right? Like when if he's not at the helm of someone else's, right?
nice. And I guess just one final question as well. I noticed that you're part of FingerprintsDAO, and there are, I know a few guys that sort of in there. I think I've had Plutonium on Punkcast as well, and I think you guys go pretty deep into a very niche corner of the internet when it comes to buying pieces of artwork. Probably the largest autoglyph collection I've seen around.
Yes.
And math castles and things like that. And I've noticed that you're on the curation committee as well. But would you mind sharing a little bit about, I guess, your role with Fingerprints DAO and how you're looking at collecting pieces for the DAO?
Sure. So the curation for fingerprints was, I should say there's someone named Sam Spike who really had a formative influence on forming the thesis behind fingerprints collection. And it's about smart contract art, essentially, like using the, it's not necessarily about on-chain or generative art, but it's about using the unique affordances of blockchain, either technically or thematically or to um yeah. So that's sort of what the fingerprints collection is about. My role in the curation committee has largely been like sort of from like a technical point of view. That's what I contribute to it. I don't have a background in, you know, I was not a professional artist before this. And so my insights are really, you know, either shooting from the hip from just like my experience from in the space, but more about what I can bring to bear um, about answering questions like technically, because that's where I'm strongest.
Yeah, there's also see your pieces in there as well. But math castles, from a technical point of view, what do you see in math castles?
Oh, plenty. Like, I mean, Math Castles is, well, they describe themselves as on-chain land art, which I think is a great short description of it. And just having the idea of having this kind of huge structure that is like spatial locations, right? So having neighbors and like it's hard to describe in words without showing a picture. There's someone Matto who's made like this nice visualization of the whole math castle. I forget exactly what it's called, but like the whole structure in 3D, and you can like pan around and see all these things. Um, and so there's a lot of interesting technical things beyond it just being beyond the on-chain storage. Like there's, I mean, 113 would have to like really give the rundown because there's a lot. You can really dive
Yeah.
into it deeply. I don't think everybody. I don't understand it in its entirety just because I haven't had enough time to uh, to dive that deep. Um, but uh, but it's an impressive project.
Yeah, 113 is another punk as well, and he's so I think it's always great to sort of see these projects coming out from punks. Yeah, I'm sort of dabbling into it as well, but I sort of feel like it's like early, it might be like early punk vibes, right? Where not a lot of people have really caught on to what it actually is, and then I think it might reveal itself a little bit later on when people catch on. But that's cool. And well, Def Beef or slash Tyler, this was a sort of fun conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And just a last closing question: if you could pass on a message to the next owner of Punk 9275, what would you like to say to them?
Well, uh, I mean, I would assume. I mean, I could like. I mean, there's the assumption that probably the next owner of that would be like my kids or something like that. So it'd be like a message for my kids, maybe. I mean, if I was a forced seller, then it would be a message for them. I don't really know. Like,
What would you say if it was your kid first?
oh, if it was my kid, then it would be like a personal message for them, and like maybe something about like like this was something that was important to me at the time, right? Like in 2020, this is 2021. This was something that had meaning to me because of this community that I was part of at the time, and I'm passing it on to you. It might and that meaning might be different, right? Like that meaning will change. You might not feel connected to those same things, but maybe you'll be connected in a different way. Um, but basically sort of to like emphasize that and like not having them seem like it's like, I don't know, that it changes based on that provenance, right? So
Nice. And what would you say if it was to somebody else? You sold it to somebody else.
if I sold it to someone else, um, I mean, like, yeah, I guess, like, to me, like, I don't know. Like, I mean, it really depends on, like, the context. Like, if it was, like, if I knew who it was that I was selling it to, or if it was, if it was like, a gift or, like, otherwise, if it's just, like, an anonymous bidder, like, I don't know what the message would be. It'd be like, "Okay, well, enjoy, you know, take good care of them."
That's good enough. Enough. This was a fun conversation as well, Def Beef. So thank you so much for your time, and great to know that you're a avid punk lover, like the rest of us. Any sort of final closing comments on your side, and what's the best way for people to find you?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun chatting. Best way to find me is on Twitter _DefBeef, and also, I mean, just on my website, right? www.defbeef.com.
Awesome. Guys, that wraps up an episode of PunkCast for the week, and we'll be back next week with another punk. Bye for now.